Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Friday everybody. Today's episode will be a little bit different. We'll be doing a deep dive into one specific topic. In the September-October edition of Foreign Affairs, Adam Posen, president of the Pettis Institute for International Economics since January 2013, penned a piece titled "The End of China's Economic Miracle: How Beijing's Struggles Could Be an Opportunity for Washington." In the piece, which we touched on briefly at the time, Posen argues that General Secretary Xi Jinping's, quote, extreme response to the pandemic produced a less dynamic economy, end quote. Specifically, he argues that the abandonment of autocratic self-restraint by Xi and the leadership of the party was not inevitable, and it drove a marked change in the behavior of Chinese households, as well as in their responses to government policies. And it is this which ended China's economic miracle. Interestingly, this article triggered much debate within China policy and financial circles, and drew Chinese financial expert Michael Pettis, who regular viewers know I often quote on this channel, into a series of public exchanges with Posen. For today, we are going to unpack some of this debate. The nuances and the disagreement between the two camps provides an excellent vehicle to think about the nature of China's economic slowdown more three-dimensionally. It also gives us an idea of how these themes are being discussed and debated in policy-making circles in the Anglophone world. At the outset, I should check my own bias by making it clear to the audience that I tend to lean towards the Pettis school of thought regarding how we should think about the Chinese financial system, the Chinese growth model, and the nature of China's economic slowdown. I find the thinking on these subjects as communicated by Pettis, George Magnus, and others to be the most convincing. I should also say that Pettis is a professor at Peking University, where I did my master's degree. However, there are different schools of thoughts on all of these questions, and I keep an open mind to these different ways of thinking. Indeed, I believe that Posen makes a strong case, and I agree with several key observations he makes. As we explore this Pettis-Posen debate, I will ensure that we unpack the salient points made by both sides. I will be employing both direct and indirect quotes from statements made in publications, including Foreign Affairs, as well as interviews and social media statements. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Sharing with someone who you think would like this sort of content is also a big help, and 50% of regular viewers are not subscribed. Subscribing helps the channel grow too, and for anyone who can go the extra mile and help keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Okay. Let's begin diving into this debate. On Tuesday of this week, Pettis and others published replies to Posen in another Foreign Affairs piece called "Who Killed the Chinese Economy? The Contested Causes of Stagnation." In his reply, titled "Inherited Trauma," Pettis argues that Posen correctly identifies the problems the Chinese economy faces, including weak consumption, anemic business investment, surging debt, and rising financial uncertainty among Chinese households. But, quote, his explanation of what has gone wrong misses the mark, neglecting the structural sources of China's economic malaise. Posen writes that China's economic troubles are the result of Xi Jinping's turn against the private sector in recent years, especially in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Under Xi, he argues, the party has reverted toward the authoritarian mean. He proposes that in response to the government's intrusion into economic life and the increasingly visible threat of state control in day-to-day commerce, an anxious Chinese public is saving more and spending less, yielding a less dynamic economy. Pettis disagrees with this argument, saying that this account gets the causality backwards. Quote, the problems facing the Chinese economy are not the consequence of recent policy shifts. They are the almost inevitable result of deep imbalances that date back nearly 2 decades and were obvious to many economists well over a decade ago. They are also the problems faced by every country that has followed a similar growth model. End quote. Regular viewers know that this growth model is the high savings, high investment model, which was implemented in the 1980s and 90s, which succeeded in that it closed the gap between the existing level of investment and the level the country could productively absorb. However, thinkers from the Pettis school, including myself, argue that this gap was closed around 2006. It was from about that time that China needed to rebalance from investment to consumption, but this required difficult business, legal, financial, and political institutional reforms. Indeed, Pettis argues that China did not reform its growth model. In fact, from 2006 through 2011, he writes, its household consumption as a percentage of GDP fell even faster than it had in the 1980s and 1990s, to 34%, compared with over 50% on average in the rest of the world. A successful growth model, Pettis points out, develops its own set of institutions along with powerful constituencies that benefit disproportionately from these institutions, making the model politically difficult to transform. As the elites who benefit from the model expand their wealth and power, they become motivated to entrench it. Quote, "This is what happened in China. In the past 2 decades, investment in China has continued to rise as rapidly as ever, even as it has progressively generated less and less value for each dollar invested. Overall growth has increasingly been driven by asset bubbles, especially in real estate, and an unsustainable rise in debt. Worse, over this period, business investment has become constrained by China's extraordinarily low consumption rate, as shaky domestic demand discouraged private businesses from expanding production." End quote. Thus, argues Pettis and others from his way of thinking, this is the true crux of China's slowdown and structural issues. We could call this the unbalanced economic model hypothesis, which focuses on how economic actors, from businesses, households, and government, behave within a certain system, versus Posen's bad king hypothesis, which focuses on how these actors behave in response to the words and actions of the top decision makers, or in this case, the top decision maker. Pettis rejects this latter hypothesis, however. Quote, "Today, even as it raises costs for businesses, government intrusion is not China's biggest problem. Its biggest problem is that it has not substantially adjusted its growth model. Retaining its current high investment model distorts the distribution of income and keeps domestic demand too weak to support domestic business investment. Government intrusion, in other words, is the consequence of weak private investment, not its driver." End quote. Pettis adds that this distinction matters enormously when thinking about how China can fix its economic problems. It must address the demand side of the economy by strengthening the share of its GDP that Chinese households retain. Until Beijing does so, or until it is willing to accept much lower growth rates, the role of the government in the economy must necessarily expand relative to that of the private sector. The role of the government in the economy must necessarily expand relative to that of the private sector. Quote, "Even if Beijing decided to reduce government intrusion, growth would not pick up except at the margin, and China's overall growth rate would continue to decline, probably to below 2 to 3%. End quote. In his reply to Pettis and others, Posen concedes that many of these points are valid, writing this week, quote, "Two things can be true at once. China's structural economic issues have reduced its growth rate over time, and increased intrusion into everyday life by the Chinese government under President Xi Jinping has changed the economic behavior of the country's people, reducing the growth rate even further." End quote. Thus, he still strongly argues that the bad king hypothesis, especially since COVID, is the best way to understand China's economic slowdown and issues. Quote, "The emergence of economic long COVID in China is a special case. The abandonment of autocratic self-restraint by Xi and the leadership of the CCP was not inevitable, and it drove a marked change in the behavior of Chinese households, as well as in their responses to government policies. My analysis is supported by data gathered since Xi took office, and especially since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, on Chinese savings, investment, capital outflows, and durable goods consumption." End quote. Posen argues that Pettis, quote, "neglects the importance of Xi's behavior in shaping outcomes and even seems to deny that the economic regime has changed." End quote. Posen also argues that Chinese growth has not been largely driven by public and government-directed investment. Between 1980 and 2013, the year Xi took control, China's private investment grew at 2.6 times the pace of state investment. And during the same period, the share of state investment fell from 80% to roughly 33% of total investment. By contrast, he continues, the party's policies under Xi have rapidly increased the investment going to state-owned enterprises, and the share of credit going to the private sector peaked in 2015 and has declined steadily since. The party, he says, has also intruded more and more into the operations of private companies. Quote, Pettis is incorrect when he claims that in the past 2 decades investment in China has continued to rise as rapidly as ever, and the evidence does not support his claim that China has had to rely on the expanding public sector to deliver the level of growth Beijing deems politically necessary. Non-private fixed asset investment, the best available proxy for public investment, began to decline in 2016 when it was 26% of Chinese GDP. By 2021, it was down to 21%, rising only slightly in 2022 to 22%, and it was the government regulation that, in 2020, killed the long-running residential property boom. Steps the CCP took because the private sector was driving growth in ways the party did not like. End quote. Posen further criticizes Pettis, arguing that he misapplies the logic of Albert Hirschman in analyzing China's political economy. Posen says that the relevant Hirschman insight is from his profound 1970 treatise Exit, Voice and Loyalty, which explains the 3 choices citizens have when forming a relationship with their government. Quote, Voice, as in criticism of government policies that could lead to civic political action, has always been severely limited by the CCP, and its use of electric surveillance and repression has only grown in recent years. Loyalty, essentially accepting that what the party leadership does on policy is right, was and largely remains the default, but that has been the case only as long as everyday commercial life was productive and undisturbed, which it has not been in recent years. That leaves only exit, and people in China have increasingly resorted to that option under Xi's autocracy. Chinese households are building up their liquid savings instead of consuming durable goods. Small enterprises are remaining liquid and investing less to reduce the risk of expropriation, and in many cases better off Chinese citizens are physically exiting by moving their assets, some of their production and their families, abroad. End quote. Posen argues that all the structural problems Pettis and others identify in China's economy exist and have long existed, but that Xi's deliberate and widening violation of his predecessor's no politics, no problem compact, particularly during the pandemic, changed the game. His critics' structuralist approach to analyzing China, quote, misrepresents the sources of the country's astonishing past growth and fails to explain the shifts unfolding today. A narrow, structuralist reading would predict that the Chinese economy would react especially well to measures that stimulate consumption and private credit, since the relative benefits to households of these measures versus government investment would be high. In fact, Chinese consumers have been notably sluggish in responding to the stimulus measures introduced since the end of 2022, even when they targeted subsidies for auto sales or mortgage payments. End quote. He ends by stating that China developed economic long COVID thanks to Xi's shift to a more autocratic approach to managing the economy. This syndrome was not inevitable, and it was not foreseen, and it will be very difficult for the autocrat who caused it to cure it. Yesterday, Pettis made his reply to these points from Posen, arguing that he ignores just how astonishingly high China's investment share of GDP is and has been. Globally, investment is roughly 25% of GDP, while even in high investment countries, it rarely exceeds 30 to 35% of GDP, except over very brief periods. China is at 44%. We're now quoting Pettis directly. Posen claims that because much of the investment in the 1990s was private sector investment, growth in that period had little to do with government involvement. That's not true. It was government policies that forced up Chinese savings to the highest levels ever seen. It was government policies that channeled these massive savings into highly controlled banks, and that directed banks to make these savings easily and very cheaply available only to the public and private sector businesses and investment the government favoured. It was the government policies that undervalued the currency, subsidized and protected private sector businesses, and massively overspent on providing China with probably the best transportation and logistical infrastructure in the world. He states that under these conditions, it is not at all surprising that the private sector was so profitable. Its profitability was a consequence of the huge direct and indirect support it received, reflected, by the way, also in the collapsing GDP share of Chinese households. China's first 2 to 3 decades of spectacular growth was very much a consequence of highly supportive government policies, even as these same policies later forced a growing public sector role once the economy could no longer deliver growth under hard budget constraints. This growing role emerged mainly because China evolved a different set of economic imbalances once China's torrid investment exceeded the country's ability to absorb it productively. This debate isn't purely academic. Understanding why China is slowing down matters tremendously to anyone who wants to understand how China's growth will evolve over the next few years and decades. If the problem is mainly anti-private sector policies implemented recently under the Xi administration, the solution is obvious. Reverse these policies and China will return to the halcyon days of 5 to 6% growth or more. If, however, the problem is that China can no longer sustain such extraordinarily high investment rates, then debt levels must rise unsustainably, and the public sector expand until Beijing chooses, or is forced, to bring debt and public sector investment under control. Because GDP growth is largely driven by growth in investment and consumption, bringing investment growth down sharply, perhaps even to below zero, means that GDP growth must continue to decline, unless Beijing can find a way of getting consumption to surge. The latter is extremely unlikely, but not impossible, in which case, according to the so-called structuralist view I support, the evolution of China's economy will depend largely on how Beijing handles the redistribution needed to get consumption to surge. If my view is correct, though, then a sharp Chinese slowdown was and continues to be inevitable, and its evolution will be moderated largely by the extent of deep and politically contentious structural reforms, not palace intrigues. That's not to say, of course, that recent policies by the Xi administration haven't mattered. They have and do, but it's more correct to see them as a consequence of deep-rooted imbalances rather than the cause of China's economic malaise. Here ends the direct quote from Pettis. It is likely that this debate will continue, and it must continue. As Pettis correctly observes, understanding why China is slowing down matters tremendously to anyone who wants to understand how China's growth will evolve over the next few years and decades. This is the story we will continue to watch here on China Update, and I hope you will all continue to come along for the ride. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a great Friday, and I will see you all tomorrow.